And last time we had looked at one attack against the fourth commandment of trying to replace it with another day of worship. And we saw that there is no biblical support for observing the first day of the week versus the seventh day of the week. And we saw that both Jesus and Paul left us the example of keeping the seventh day Sabbath. But there are some arguments that are made just against the idea of keeping the Sabbath. And so we'd like to look at a few of those today. The first category is, well, how do you know that the day that you're keeping is the actual seventh day? And there's different versions of it. Some would look at, well, in the Bible, you had Joshua, he had that prayed, and they had that long day, and later on Hezekiah, prayed, and God even turned the sun back. And so, messing with time, didn't that mess up how we could know when the Sabbath was since creation, that it might have been lost then? Well, of course, when does a day begin in the Bible? It's sunset. And so if Joshua has a long day, well, it's not the next day until sunset. So it may have been hours later than normal, but it was still the next day that happened. And the same thing with Hezekiah as far as that. So those two things have no effect on the daily cycle. One that perhaps might, at least on the surface, seem a bit more serious is, well, the calendar has been changed. And so how do we know that didn't affect things? Well, there's only been one calendar change since the time of Christ. In the Roman Empire, when Christ was born, they were using what is known as the Julian calendar, named after Julius Caesar. And part of that was they had the idea of leap years, and so we know every 4 years we have February 29th. But that's not quite right. Because it actually gives you a little bit too much time. And so by the 1500s, they were like seeing, well, the spring equinox, which is supposed to be March 20th, was now about March 10th or something like that. It was much earlier, and said, well, we've gotten off from the seasons. And so as they had figured it out and realized, well, yeah, we need leap years, but we need to have some that would be leap years that aren't leap years. And so, it's like if it ends in, in 2 zeros, but unless it's a this, and it's a whole formula of knowing when you don't have the leap years, but it's to get it more in sync with our trip around the sun. And so in 1582, began the transfer from the Julian calendar, which had been in effect since the time of Christ, before the time of Christ, to the Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory. And Thursday, October 4th, 1582, was followed by Friday, October 15th, 1582. So 10 days were dropped, but you notice there was no change in the weekly cycle. Thursday was followed by Friday. And then I believe it was in the 1750s that the English-speaking countries adopted the Gregorian calendar. But again, it was the same thing that, I think by that point they had to drop 11 days. But again, whatever day that they did it, it was like, the one was here, then the 10 days are dropped off, jumped forward, but it's still Thursdays followed by Friday. And so again, those did not affect the weekly cycle. And we have to believe that, if the Sabbath had somehow been lost sight of, between creation and the time of the Exodus, well, God showed when the Sabbath was quite clearly all through the Exodus period by not sending manna on that day. So he worked the miracle, really the double miracle that, because most of the time, if they tried to collect extra manna, it would rot overnight. But on Friday, they were supposed to collect twice as much, and it was good through the Sabbath. And then none fell on the Sabbath. And so clearly that God was showing when the Sabbath was then. And if, again, somehow it had been lost sight of in the intervening time between then and the time of Christ, surely Jesus would have set that right. But He worshiped on the same seventh-day Sabbath as everybody else was. And so the Sabbath has not been lost through calendar changes or forgetfulness or anything like that. The Jews have continued to observe the Sabbath since the time of Christ. The Christians, the majority of Christians who worship on the first day of the week, well, they claim to know when the first day of the week is. And if you know when the first day of the week is, then you know when the seventh day of the week is. And so time has not been lost, and the Sabbath has not been lost in that way. But there are some Bible passages that are also sometimes used to bring the Sabbath into question. Let's go to Romans chapter 14. Romans 14, verse 5. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. So on the surface, that seems to say, well, hey, if some people want to esteem one day and, some people a different day or every day or whatever, that doesn't, Paul seems to be saying it doesn't matter anymore. But is that what Paul is really saying? Well, we need some context here. So let's go back to verse 1. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. He who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. So as we look at the context, we see that the context is about eating and not eating. And so apparently Paul is dealing with, there was some disputes on what day should you fast or what days should you fast. Because we know that in the early church, they fasted 2 days a week in following the Pharisees. The Jewish Pharisees fasted 2 days a week. Jesus mentions that in the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. And the Pharisee's up there praying, I fast twice a week and stuff, as he's praying and his holiness. But there was some dispute of, well, do you fast, Tuesday and Thursday or Wednesday and Friday? There was some dispute on which days you should fast. And apparently some were saying, well, whether you should fast or not fast. And Paul is saying, God has not commanded a particular fast days here. And so whatever your conscience tells you, do that. And so if you feel that you should fast on these particular days, well, go ahead and fast on those days. If you don't feel that God has called you to fast, well, then don't fast. But most of all, he says, don't condemn the other people. But he's talking about things that are doubtful. And things that are just sort of a matter of, well, whatever you have been convinced of and believe. Now, can the Sabbath rightfully fall into that category? God is very clear on when the Sabbath is and how it is to be kept. There's nothing doubtful about it. But since these fast days were a human invention, Paul is saying, well, as long as you're, whatever your conscience is telling you, if you study, you're convinced, saying, hey, I believe we should fast, then fast. I don't think we need to fast, well, then don't fast. But just don't condemn one another over these things that are of human invention. But it has nothing to do with trying to remove one of God's 10 commandments here. Then the passage that is probably used the most is Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Colossians chapter 2. Oops. And we're going to look at verse 16. So let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths. Well, there Paul says, don't let anyone judge you concerning a Sabbath. So the Sabbath must be done away with. It's no longer a matter that we should judge anyone over. And you Adventists, you say, hey, everyone needs to be keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. You're judging everyone, and so you're not following what Paul says here. Now, the historic Adventist position is based on the context. So let's go ahead and read verse 17. Or we will reread verse 16 and then add on verse 17. So let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. So it's saying that these days, these festivals and these Sabbaths, it says these are shadows of things to come, but the substances of Christ, or the body is of Christ, the reality is in Christ. It's saying these were things that pointed forward to Jesus. And based on that context, that these would then be considered to be ceremonial Sabbaths. Because the entire ceremonial system pointed forward to Jesus. Every sacrifice pointed forward to Jesus as the Lamb of God. All the different feast days pointed forward to aspects of Christ's ministry and so on, and the salvation history. And so all of these things, every aspect of the tabernacle, so that whole ceremonial system was pointing forward to Jesus. But Paul's saying now the reality has arrived, so we don't need to be judging anyone on these things anymore. But the question is, and so that's been the understanding, but some have called that idea into question. And I'll just give one example of that. This is from the Watchman magazine, October of 1998, an article by Larry Halfley, and says, for example, recognizing that Sabbatarians believe that Colossians 2:16 cannot refer to the weekly Sabbath, Larry Halfley opined, one can understand why. Colossians 2:16 is the only one of those references that says the Sabbath is not binding. So Sabbatarians must either give up their error concerning Sabbath keeping or get rid of this verse. And he concludes that Seventh-day Adventists are condemned by the text of Colossians 2:16. So, many people see that, no, this is talking about the seventh-day Sabbath. And so the context would seem to argue no, but they would look at the words here, and that the Greek word there is sabbata, and that they would say that this term, that the Sabbath, including the Day of Atonement, the ceremonial Sabbaths, including the Day of Atonement, are never designated simply as sabbata, which is the single Greek term that's used here. So he's saying, whenever in the Greek translation of the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the term sabbata is never used for one of these ceremonial Sabbaths. Therefore, Paul must be talking about, but that term is used for the seventh-day Sabbath, so that's what Paul is talking about here. And they think that basically the pattern is that Paul is talking about festivals, so that's yearly things, then new moons, that's monthly things, and then Sabbaths, that would be weekly things. So they see him moving in this decreasing amount from yearly to monthly to weekly here, and based upon that word. But we need to familiarize ourselves and look, well, is this actually so or not? And if we want to turn to Leviticus chapter 23, we find, in Leviticus chapter 23, we find the list of all these various Jewish feast days that happened throughout the year. And in verse 3, first it mentions the Sabbath. It 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Then it continues on. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month, at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The seventh day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. And so we find that. So the first and the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread were days where they were to do no ordinary work. But you notice it doesn't use the word Sabbath on those. And then the Feast of Tabernacles, likewise, the first and the last days were a day where they were to do no ordinary work, but it doesn't actually use the word Sabbath. It does use the word Sabbath rest here when we get to the Feast of Tabernacles there, a Sabbathizing, as the puts there. But two of these do use the term Sabbath. The Feast of Trumpets. Then the Lord spoke to, verse 24, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord." And then following that, the Day of Atonement. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, all the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you, shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that day shall be cut off from his people. And any person who does any work on that same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath." And so these are the yearly routine that would happen at the sanctuary that the Jews would go through. And we find that as we look at it, there are some different words that get used there, including the word that's translated as feast. Now, a lot of times we call these all feasts, but actually in the Bible, the word feast doesn't apply to all of these that happen through the year. The Hebrew word for feast is chag or hog, and it's related to the Arab word hajj. Now, if you've ever heard of Muslims that practice in the hajj, that's where they make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And this word was applied to the unleavened bread, to Pentecost, and to tabernacles. Now, those three had something in common. They all were commanded that all the males had to travel to Jerusalem. So they were pilgrim feasts. That term is not used for trumpets or Day of Atonement. Now, and then while the others had some, you might say, Sabbath-like aspects to them, where it talks about doing no common work or no servile work, on the 7th day Sabbath, and then especially then on the Day of Atonement, it says no work whatsoever is to be done. And so the Day of Atonement is referred to as a Sabbath of solemn rest, or which is Sabbata Sabbaton is how the Greek translation of that. And that's what most say, okay, that's how feast day Sabbaths are referred to, as Sabbata Sabbaton here. But yet we continue in that very same verse 32, at the end where it says, "You shall from evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath." This whole verse is talking about the Day of Atonement Sabbath. But where it says celebrate your Sabbath, there it's just Sabbata by itself. And so the argument has been that Sabbata only refers to the seventh-day Sabbath when it's by itself. Only then Sabbata Sabbaton is used to refer to those Sabbaths that were part of the Jewish feast days. But that's not the case when we actually study out the language. It's used here to refer to the Day of Atonement. And so, which was not included with the feasts, the festivals, the hogs. They're the pilgrim feasts. And so we find that Paul then is talking about, he says, feasts, new moons, Sabbaths. Well, the Greek word for that the hog is translated as is hjorte. Well, that's the word that Paul uses there in Colossians 2:16 when it says feasts. And if you look at how that word is used, it's always used to translate hog. In the Old Testament, the word hog is never applied to trumpets or Day of Atonement. And in the New Testament, hjorte is always used in connection with the pilgrim feasts. It's not used in connection with the others either. So it follows the pattern that the Hebrew had laid out. And so when Paul is talking about feasts, he's not talking about everything that happened here. He's talking about the pilgrim feasts. Then he talks about the new moon, and then he talks about the Sabbata, which would apply to the trumpets and Day of Atonement especially. And so he's not working from yearly, monthly, daily. He's talking about something happened yearly to monthly, back to some other things that happened yearly. And so he's setting up a chiasm, an inverted parallelism, as they call it, where you move from one to a center point and then back out again. And Paul has some other chiasms in Colossians as well. And so it's not that he's a foreigner to using it even in that particular letter. So the feasts are referring to the pilgrim feasts of unleavened bread, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. The Sabbata there is referring to the Day of Atonement and most likely trumpets, the ones that weren't included with the pilgrim feasts. And so that fits with the context as well, which is these are shadows of things to come. Because all of these things were part of what pointed forward to Jesus' ministry, his life, his death, his sacrifice, and all that was to happen. And so those things came to an end at Christ's crucifixion. Because we know that at Christ's crucifixion, the veil in the temple was ripped in two from the top to the bottom, symbolizing that the sacrificial system, the ceremonial system had now been brought to an end. Whereas the Sabbath is part of God's moral law. And so you can't get rid of it without getting rid of the rest of the moral law. And so some will try to argue, well, the law is done away with. Well, okay, is the law done away with? And then is it okay for me to steal from you? Is it okay for me to murder you? Is it okay for me to sleep with your wife? Well, no. And it gets down to it, and usually you get down to, well, we like 9 of the commandments, but, to get rid of that 4th commandment that we don't want to keep, we'll say that all of them are done away with, then somehow the others, either because they're moral principles, they're still in effect, or they're reinstituted later, but the Sabbath wasn't reinstituted. There's all kinds of arguments to that effect, but it's not consistent. It's like either the law was done away with, so there is no more sin, and we can do what we want to do, or God's moral law is still in effect. It still defines what sin is. God's law can't save us. It was never meant to save us. But it points out what is right and what is wrong. And what is right and what is wrong hasn't changed before or after the cross. If it was a sin before the cross, it's a sin after the cross. If it was a sin before you came to Jesus, it's a sin after you come to Jesus. Because some would try to argue that, well, when I come to Jesus, when I receive grace, I'm now under grace, I'm not under the law. So again, if you're not under the law, does that mean you can do anything that you want to do now? Or is it actually mean that if you're truly under grace, is your life being transformed so that you can actually live the law out? And that's what Paul asked, have we made the law void through faith? He says, God forbid. In fact, he says we establish the law, because the only way to truly keep God's law is if when we're in a faith relationship with Jesus. We need power outside of ourselves to enable us to truly keep God's law from the heart. We need that new covenant experience of a new heart, a new mind, one where God's law is written on them. It becomes an internal principle rather than external force acting upon us. But, God, Hebrews 13, as we read in our scripture, says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Jesus doesn't change. God in the Old Testament says, I am the Lord, I change not. And so God is not fickle. He doesn't have different methods of salvation for one group of people or a different group of people. He doesn't have one set of laws, defining what's right for them and a different set of laws defining what's right for somebody else. God doesn't change those things because the law is the reflection of God's character. And, the Sabbath is rooted in the creative power of God. It's the memorial of creation. God didn't stop being creator because Jesus died on the cross. There's no, it's a memorial of God's creator. And who, according to the New Testament, who was the active agent in creation? Jesus was. And so we honor Jesus on the Sabbath as a memorial of he as the creator. And then after the cross, the meaning of the Sabbath expands even greater. Just as on the Friday of the first week, it says, it was, God finished things. He finished his work, and then he rests on the Sabbath. Well, on the Friday of Christ's crucifixion, right before he dies, he says, it is finished, and he died. He had finished his sacrificial work. He rested in the tomb on the Sabbath, and then rose up on Sunday morning. And so the Sabbath is full of Jesus in our relationship to him. Now, can we take the Sabbath all the wrong way, and can we try to follow it legalistically? Sure we can. But you can do that with any of God's laws or anything. If we're trying to earn brownie points with God by keeping the Sabbath, that's not going to work. You can't earn any brownie points with God. It's because God is loving and gracious that he has freely offered salvation to us when we accept Christ as our Savior. But he promises as we receive Christ, we also receive a new heart, a new mind, one where his law is written. It becomes an internalized principle. When we fall in love with Jesus, we fall in love with God, we want to do those things that are pleasing in his sight. And that's that. And Jesus, himself said, think not that I am come to destroy the law. He says, I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill the law, or to fill up the law. And so many who think that Jesus came to destroy the law have gotten it all backwards, and they're just missing out on the blessing of the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is such a blessing when we rightly understand it, we rightly participate in it. Jesus told us the Sabbath was made for mankind. It was God's gift to us. In an unfallen world, God gave us the gift of the Sabbath. It's one of those few things that we have from before the fall that are still here with us. We have the Sabbath, we have marriage, and Satan hates all of those things that are part of that unfallen world. And so he attacks the Sabbath, he attacks marriage, and but God only wants what is best for us. And he designed us to have that weekly rest from the busyness of the world, to have that time to focus on him, to spend time communing with him and being refreshed by him. We need the Sabbath and the blessings that God has placed on it. He put them on there at creation. They're still on there for us. And so let's thank him for what he has given to us.